The Treasury is planning to tell banks that they must protect free speech as a row over so-called financial counselling is growing bigger by the day.
The Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, is concerned at the increasing blacklisting of customers with controversial views. They include, of course, Nigel Farage, and has asked the City Minister to investigate. So
let's bring in senior Tory backbencher Sir Charles Walker. Good morning, Sir Charles. Thank you so much for joining us. Do you think Jeremy Hunt has a point? Should we be concerned about this?
We should be concerned. Banks have been closing the bank accounts of politicians now for about 6 or 7 years with very little reason to do so. So I think this is just a continuing trend, and Dominic Lawson wrote about it in today's Daily Mail, obviously off the back of Nigel Farage's experience. So it's very good to get this out into the public domain again.
On what basis? I mean, I was staggered to read Dominic Lawson's column today, Sir Charles, talking about his own 16-year-old daughter with Down syndrome. They wouldn't allow her to have a bank account because of her grandfather, the late Nigel Lawson, who is described, of course, as a politically exposed person. I don't get the connection.
So these money laundering rules were brought in by the EU in 2015, and we implemented them into law in 2017, we thought with safeguards. But money laundering rules were really meant to go after despots in corrupt economies and countries. They were never designed to go after members of Parliament, members of the House of Lords, and more particularly their children and grandchildren. But the banks have been gold-plating the legislation. And they're not obliged to let you know why they are closing your bank account or refusing you a bank account. They'll just say, no, we can't do that under the tipping off laws. So they can pretty much act as they like.
And what can you do about it? What can the Chancellor of the Exchequer do about it, Sir Charles?
Well, there were meant to be protections in place, and I would suggest that anybody suffering discrimination like Nigel Farage and others go to the Bank of England and Financial Services Act 2016. Sorry, I'm looking at it now. I have it on my desk. And in particular, go to Part 20C, because there are meant to be protections. You can complain to the FCA, you can complain to the Ombudsman, and when banks have been found to be acting unreasonably, they can be subject to a compensation claim. But this just simply isn't working. I don't know why. Banks are sort of turning their face to it. And the situation is getting progressively worse. I mean, I know of backbench members of Parliament who've never held any ministerial office at all, being refused mortgages and having their bank accounts closed purely because they are members of Parliament.
Gosh, Nigel's been at pains to point out that he hasn't had an explanation from the bank. And I think it's completely commonsensical to think if he had done anything that was financially inappropriate, he certainly wouldn't be shining a light on it in this particular way. So what reason could there be, Charles, for Nigel Farage having his bank accounts refused or closed now? Why?
So the banks can do this with impunity because they literally can hide behind the tipping off law and say, no, we're not allowed to tell you why we're closing your bank account because you could be under investigation, which normally isn't the case. I do think Nigel Farage is owed an explanation. I think he should take it up to the FCA, with the FCA. He should quote Part 20C of the Bank of England Act 2016, and he should carry on with this. Now, I know the government is seeking to amend the legislation and put in further protections to prevent banks from behaving this way. But actually, there are meant to be these protections in place now. And what needs to happen is they need to be enforced. That's what needs to happen. It's not, I mean, new laws in this area might be welcome, but if they're not enforced, we'll end up in the same place as we are now.
Absolutely. And it depends who's in power as to what, there'll be people watching this who will say, well, maybe a left-wing person will say, well, I have no problem with Nigel Farage having his bank account frozen. Well, if the political wind changes, it could become any one of us. And that's why this matters, doesn't it?
Well, it doesn't discriminate between Conservative members of Parliament or, say, Labour members of Parliament. And the situation for Labour members of Parliament will become more apparent, dare I say worse, if they were to win the next general election and they were to form the government and hold ministerial office, because obviously they would come under closer closer scrutiny. Unfairly, might I say. We have a very robust media. Your co-host works for the Daily Mail. The Daily Mail doesn't let politicians get away with much. We have the independent expenses system called IPSO. We have the Register of Members' Interests. We've seen members of Parliament dismissed from Parliament for behaving inappropriately financially. So we have lots of protections in this country to make sure that those people doing wrong are found out. As I say, these laws were designed initially to stop money laundering from corrupt regimes around the world, not to place restrictions on democratically elected politicians or people who have been democratically elected or appointed to the House of Lords.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, that's Sir Charles Walker. Thanks so much for joining us, Sir Charles Walker, the senior backbencher who's been raising this as an issue.
And quote, Nigel Farage is owed an explanation, he said.
Nigel, if you are watching and listening, you know what to do. The Bank of England Financial Services Act, Clause 24.
We aim to help.